Good evening, everyone. My name is Audrey Davis, and I am the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. Thank you for attending this evening's program, Reparations at VTS, Uncovering a Not So Hidden History, which is sponsored by the Alexandria Historical Society, the Alexandria Black History Museum, and the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project. All three organizations support and promote Alexandria's vital and interesting African American history. A few housekeeping tips before we start. To help preserve bandwidth and limit disruptions, you will notice that your audio and video are off. However, the chat is open, and we encourage you to place questions in the chat during the lecture, and all questions will be answered after the lecture. Tonight, you are in for a real treat. Our audience is the first to formally learn about the work that is happening at the Virginia Theological Seminary, or VTS, as part of their reparations project. I know we all look forward to learning about this important and challenging work. This evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ebony Davis, who is a public historian with a passion for sharing and preserving Black history. She holds an MA in Museum Studies and Historical Preservation from Morgan State University and is currently pursuing a PhD in African Diaspora History at Howard University. For nearly 15 years, Davis has operated within the field of public history, working for local, state, and national institutions in the Americas and Africa. In 2017, Davis began working at the Virginia Theological Seminary, or VTS, as the archivist for the African American Episcopal Historical Collection. And in 2020, she transitioned to VTS's office as the Office of Multicultural Ministries. As the Associate for Multicultural Ministries, Programming and Historical Research for Reparations, Davis coordinates the research efforts of VTS's reparations program and works directly with descendant families. I know we're all very excited to learn about the new developments at VTS. So without further ado, I give you Ebony Davis. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Ebony Davis, as Audrey said, and I work at VTS in our reparations program. My role with the reparations program is essentially to coordinate the implementation and the research side and to directly work with descendants. So we're going to get into that history tonight, and I look forward to your questions when I'm done. Julia Parker, Millie, and Sophie, 3 enslaved women hired out to VTS from Mount Vernon. Carter Dowling, enslaved by the Fitzhugh family, labored at VTS until his escape in 1858. Harriet Stewart McKnight Shorts, a washerwoman. Her husband, Burr Shorts, a farmhand, and their 10 children lived and worked in the household of Cassius Lee, VTS trustee, secretary, and treasurer. Joseph Terrell, Philip Terrell, John William Terrell, and William Terrell also lived under Lee. Joseph and Philip were farmhands. John William was a laborer, and William a cook at VTS. Bernie Bunny McKnight, listed as a domestic service for Cassius Lee on the 1870 census. Harriet Henny Tate and William Tate, enslaved in the household of VTS faculty member Edward Lippett. Matilda and Nathan Dixon, a washerwoman and farmhand. Albert Fortune, enslaved by John Johns, 4th Bishop of the Diocese of Virginia, a founder of VTS, and president of the Board of Trustees. Wallace Wanzer, a wheelwright, carpenter, and blacksmith who contracted his services out to VTS as a freedman before and after the Civil War. David Middleton Sr. and David Middleton Jr., freedmen and skilled bricklayers who contracted their services to VTS. Ann Curtis and William Russell, recorded in the household of William Sparrow, VTS faculty member. Lewis Washington, a 25-year-old male recorded in the household of VTS faculty member Joseph Packard. These 22 names, belong to African Americans who labored at VTS during the antebellum and Reconstruction period. A few were freedmen, others refugees or contraband, but the majority were enslaved. I spent the last several months sifting through and piecing together all the information our reparations researchers have unearthed. I've read personal correspondences detailing the buy and sell of enslaved Africans in Virginia, racked my brain trying to make sense of 18th and 19th century tax records, and quietly sighed and shook my head at slave ads posted by the seminary, my employer. These documents tell a true and ugly story of this institution's role in American chattel slavery. They shed light on just how integrated slavery was to the everyday workings of society, even at a place like Virginia Theological Seminary. But they also give voice to the enslaved, the oppressed, the forgotten, and the invisible. Because of this work, we are learning more and more about the people at VTS who were rarely allowed to tell their own story. Stories that are vibrant and inspiring, yet ordinary, and in many ways to me, quite familiar. With this research, we're finally able to not only identify those who toiled for our benefit, but also learn about, share, and honor the life they lived. As I read through the oral history interviews of descendants of African Americans who worked here under the weight of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, I am so encouraged to see that despite the climate of prejudice and hate, they lived full lives, created strong communities, and passed on a rich legacy. What a privilege it is for me to play a small part in sharing their story and bringing voice to the truth of their ancestors' lives. I share this first anecdotal bit, hopefully to set the stage and speak the names of those who have gone unknown for far too long, but also to establish the weight that comes along with a project like this. This is not easy work. This, in many cases, can be personal work, and it's quite deliberate work, and it's uncomfortable, but it's work that must be done. In September 2019, Virginia Theological Seminary announced the creation of a reparations endowment fund and the intent to research, uncover, recognize African Americans who toiled under the oppression of VTS during slavery and throughout the Jim Crow era. The endowment is fully funded by VTS as part of its commitment to recognizing the racism in its past and working toward healing in the future. Additional funds have since been allocated to support the work of African American congregations that have historical ties to the seminary, create programs that promote justice and inclusion, and elevate the work and voices of African American alumni and clergy within the Episcopal Church, especially in historically Black congregations. Our reparations program is a twofold initiative that includes a research team comprised of historical and genealogical experts, Charbaugh, Elizabeth Drimbus, Maddie McCoy, and Chris Pope, and an implementation effort comprised of the Office of Multicultural Ministries, which includes Dr. Jill Thompson and myself, as well as members of our reparations subcommittee. The research team is tasked with gathering historical documentation and conducting genealogical research to find living descendants. The implementation effort is tasked with the administration of the program, specifically fostering relationships with the descendant families to assess their needs and desires as beneficiaries, determining the program's policies, and managing the program's financial matters. To date, according to the best information available, our research team has uncovered the names of 22 African Americans who labored at VTS during the antebellum period, and 8 families whose ancestors worked at VTS during the Jim Crow era. Within these families are dozens of individuals who worked at VTS in service positions such as janitor, waiter, laundress, cook, farmhand, driver, helper, and domestic servant. Here's a listing of the named individuals researched thus far. I have omitted the last names to respect the privacy of the descendants we are currently working with. The Jim Crow era has yielded the largest volume of information to date. As many of you are surely aware, Alexandria has quite a resilient Black community, and many within that community have ties to the seminary that go back several generations. We are fortunate to have the benefit of that living memory to aid us in this process of uncovering this history. Out of the dozen or so major Black families in this area, our researchers have interviewed 8. Of those 8 families, 2 have already received reparations payment. The 3rd will be in receipt of their first payment by the close of next week. And we are currently in conversation with the remaining 5 families to sort out their wishes within the program so that they also can begin receiving payments. At the moment, we have yet to connect with any living descendants of known enslaved people from the antebellum period, but the research efforts have been overwhelmingly fruitful. Of the 22 names uncovered, all but 2 have surnames. We've also been able to paint a picture of what Alexandria's particular slave society would have looked like, mapping out a landscape that highlights the area's commercial and social industries, its need for domestic labor versus physical labor versus skilled labor, the different seasons that require more or less labor, and most importantly, the centrality of the Episcopal Church, its clergymen, parishioners, and subsidiary institutions to the inner workings of this entire network of enslavement. I titled this talk, Not So Hidden History, because so far, what we have found is that the problem wasn't uncovering the stories of Black people at the seminary, it was that no one was looking. And I want to be clear that the work of our researchers is vital, and I surely couldn't do it on my best day. But what I'm saying is, and not to mention their connections to the community, the content, they're a major benefit to the program. And I don't want to imply at all what they do is easy. But I am saying that the records that have led us to all of these names and all of these people have always been there. Until we began this research, the going line at VTS was something like, while the institution didn't directly own slaves, we were complicit, or we benefited from slave laborers, or we know slave labor was used to build this or that building. This conclusion was drawn from historical documents that highlight an agreement between VTS agent C.H. Bland and John Augustus Washington, the great nephew of George and Mary Washington at Mount Vernon, where 3 enslaved women were hired out to the seminary. Those records offered cover and plausible deniability, making it easier to somewhat stand on the right side of history. However, alongside those same records was documentation that further implicated the seminary's role in the institution of slavery. The records were there. They weren't hidden. They weren't buried deep in a basement somewhere. They were right there. All right. So now I want to kind of transition from the historical piece and dive into our process, specifically on the implementation side, before I conclude and open the floor for questions. Keeping in mind that no case is exactly the same, thus far, our typical process is as follows. The research team reports its findings and shares the names and contact information of identified descendant families. Dr. Joe Thompson and I follow up with the families to further share program specifics, offer a meet and greet with the dean, and begin working through the details of their wishes for their shares of the fund. We often encourage them to come to the table with whatever creative ideas they may have, be it pulling the money together, donating it, setting up a scholarship, dedicating it to a larger financial goal. nothing is off the table, keeping in mind that this will be an annual payment that they and their descendants or designated beneficiaries will receive from here on out. Once all of that is ironed out, we authorize the payment and, if able, honor any other requests granted. Our process for determining which descendants are eligible is as follows. On July 1 of each year, there will be an assessment of the funds available for distribution to eligible descendants in the program. In each family, a share of those funds will be provided annually to the members of the generation that is closest to the enslaved person or Jim Crow era employee. The generation must have at least one living member. If a person in an eligible generation is deceased, then the value of his or her share will be divided equally among his or her children. Recipients of a share may designate someone other than themselves to receive the funds. Here's a fictitious sample case of a descendant family due reparations from VTS. In this example, Eliza Jackson worked at VTS during the Jim Crow era. As a member of the generation of this family that has living descendants, as members of the generation of this family that has living descendants, her three children, Keith, Frances, and Joanna, are the shareholders. As such, each of them will receive an individual share of the reparations fund. And because Keith is deceased, his share will be divided between his three children. In developing this process, we are fully aware that it is most certainly not a perfect, foolproof plan. What we are slowly finding out, though, is that it is useful, and we're getting really good feedback from the families. This work is new to all of us, and we will likely get things wrong and regroup, develop a better plan, because that's just the reality with such an undertaking. But that doesn't mean it's not worth the effort. What I've learned through this project is to prioritize the deliberate intentions of the work, which are to repair the material consequences of this institution's role in slavery and build equitable relationships with the community. Again, there's no right way to do that. There's no one size fits all fix. Each family, each individual descendant will have their own expectations, opinions, personal relationship with the history of this institution and their ancestor. And there's no way with any amount of money that we could ever begin to satisfy the void that's in that space. That's why this work is in earnest, simply about a chance to right a wrong, to humbly atone and respect the outcome, whatever it may be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony. Thank you so much for informing us what has been going on with VTS. And we've got a lot of questions in the chat, but I first wanted to ask you, when it was announced, when VTS announced what they were doing, and you were one of the very early larger religious organizations to do this, what was the response that you got? What was the feedback that you were getting at VTS?
At VTS, people were excited. They felt it was overdue, and they were, I think, impressed that the administration had made this decision. I'll say personally, I was. There was an understanding that the institution participated in slavery in some form or fashion, and there was no questions about that. So a decision was made based off of that, and then they wanted to follow up with the research. But I appreciated that there wasn't kind of any nuance where you have to qualify, that they wanted to just say, we did this thing, it was not good, we're going to try to do right. And I think other people felt the same.
And you weren't receiving any kind of negative pushback or?
If they were, I don't know about it. We might have to talk to our communications office.
I mean, I think it's really amazing the work that you're doing. And I remember, I mean, being in the field for as long as I have been. I mean, I've been here at the museum 28 years. When reparations were talked about a long time ago, it was kind of considered something that was fringe and that would never happen. And now you're actually seeing the reality of it and seeing the acknowledgement of the inequity. And I think that VTS is to be lauded for taking this step very early on and making a commitment to this. And we have quite a number of questions in the chat. So one of the first questions is, are there records at the Alexandria City Archives on the enslaved persons as well as freedmen in the pre-Civil War era, similar to what has been assembled from Fairfax County records?
I can't, let me pull up the chat so I can kind of read along as you say that. I really can't speak what's in the Alexandria archives. We do not have those direct records in the seminary archives, but there may be some overlap.
Great. And how did, I know from our chat that at least you're saying that 2 families have been contacted already. And one of the questions one of the people asking the question wants to know, how did the families react when they were contacted?
Fortunately, the families, we have an amazing genealogist and researcher, Charbal, which I'm sure you all are familiar with her and her work, specifically with the Fort Ward community and the Freeman Cemetery. And so those families are from that same group of people, and they already had a relationship with Char. And that's one of the things we're also grateful for having Char on this team, because she's from this area. She knows the community well. She has personal relationships in a way that the seminary does not, frankly, because of its terrible history. And so Char has been really vital in helping us extend and reach out to the community. And they have been overall interested. And they, I'm sure people are have a side eye and are, cautious. And I think what's important on our end is that we have no expectation in how anybody feels, how any descendant family feels, how any of them receive this is they have every right, good, bad, ugly. That's not the intention behind this work, but it does seem so far that people have been looking forward to being a part of the program.
Another question, is your team collecting any information from descendants, for example, oral histories from the enslaved people of VTS? So if they're family legacies of stories, if so, is there a plan to release these to the public, either via a book or a website? Would love to learn more about these individuals and their lives at VTS.
Yes, there are. So far we have, goodness, we probably have a dozen or more oral histories conducted in the field by the researchers with families in the area. We will release the information as the families give us an okay to. It will live on our website at some point, and there are plans for down the road to have a memorial of sorts on campus and maybe do some type of formal official sharing of all of the research. It's a major priority for me to make sure that the stories of all of these people are never forgotten. So I would like to share them with the blessing of each family as they feel comfortable. But that's the plan right now for the immediate future.
And do you have any plans for educational opportunities at VTS regarding the Episcopal Church and slavery?
Not at the moment. COVID has, as I don't need to say this, it slowed everything down. And so I think our ideas around programming for this project were put on the back burner so we could prioritize the research and the implementation and really working and building relationships with the family. But I would say I would love to do something like that down the road, especially once, the world opens back up. Because I think, as I've said, reparations is new. It's new to all of us. How we do this, what we do, what we get right, what we get wrong, and all of the information that we find out, I think should be shared with as many people as possible.
And when you talk about families' wishes, What do these usually include? What have families been most concerned about?
So I'll give an example. There was one family that wanted to make sure that they could set up something for their grandchildren. Well, there was one descendant within that family that wanted to, she was concerned about maybe having her shares be specifically designated for her grandchild for school. There was another who came to the table and was interested in pursuing a doctoral degree at VTS. So we were able to kind of fast track that process for her to be to join our student body. So with things like that, we understand that this money is not enough, not even, it doesn't even begin to be enough. And so we really encouraged them to come with other creative ideas. And the dean, when he announced this, said, nothing is off the table. So if you bring it to us, we're going to see what can be done to meet the need.
Do you have any plans for a exhibition about what you've been doing? I mean, are you planning, like thinking ahead years down the road, how you want to capture this moment in time and the work that you're doing? In what ways might you do that if it's not an exhibition? Would there be other ways?
People keep floating around writing books. That's not what I'm committing to at the moment. But maybe Dr. Thompson would love to take on that charge. There will be something. First and foremost will be something to memorialize the people who labored at VTS. So that will be the priority, and how that looks. It will not just be one plaque, one place. The seminary is really good at naming things after people and giving something the honor of this or that. And so we want to try to incorporate that practice in how we acknowledge and memorialize the African Americans who were also vital to the founding of the seminary.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Another question, you had a descendant from Episcopal High School. Will the research with the research this fund also cover descendants here with the high school?
With Episcopal?
Yeah, that's what I'm
what we're finding is that specifically during the Jim Crow era, there were people who worked at both institutions. And so in that case, yes, because they worked at VTS. In the antebellum period, Episcopal High School and Virginia Seminary were one institution until, excuse me, about 1923. And so students from that time period, descendants from that time period also would be covered.
Great, thank you. Another question is, has there been any communication with the descendants of the slave holders? Have they been put in contact with the descendants of the enslaved? And we are actually getting questions like this as we move forward, uncovering our lynching history with our Alexandria Community Remembrance Project. So interested to hear your take on this.
That's the first time that has kind of been brought to my attention. And if we were to do that, it would be because the family requested it. Because again, priority is building relationships with the local Black community. And if we were, I mean, you know, all of the founding faculty members except one were slaveholders, and they had their slaves with them on campus. And they were used not only in their personal households, but also to enrich the seminary. And so if we were to find a descendant of someone who was enslaved in the household of Packard, and they requested to be put in contact, that's not something that, I mean, if we were able to do that, I would not be opposed to doing that. I guess I should say if both families wanted to.
If both families were amenable to that. Mm-hmm. Another question comes from someone with a history at Meade Memorial Episcopal Church, and the question is, as a child of Meade Memorial Episcopal Church and knowing the history of the church and the seminary and seeing many familiar names on the list you shared, is there a component of the reparation program to research the connections with this historic church and the seminary?
Absolutely. So the reparations program I know I said it's twofold and it has two parts, but there are other elements. All of that I discussed tonight had to do with the descendant families, descendants of those who were enslaved and who worked under the Jim Crow era. But we also have two other elements where we will work with historically Black churches in the area. Mead Memorial and Oakland Baptist are the two that are directly connected to VTS. We will also work with African-American alumni from VTS and other Black clergy at historically Black churches and other historically Black congregations. And I would like to say that that money that we will do with the reparative work with those groups is not from this 1.7 initial fund. And we just haven't gotten started with that part. It's all in the works. We've really been working with the families right now, but it is part of the entire program to kind of capture the Alexandria's Black community with the inclusion of Mead Memorial and Oakland Baptist. And that includes their research, and we'll be sitting down and kind of asking what their needs are and seeing how we can meet them as well. And again, nothing will be off the table in terms of their requests as well.
No, that's great, because both of these churches have such an important legacy here in Alexandria and in their communities, and do wonderful work themselves. So that's very good to hear that they're being included in this. Another question, this is such important work. Any surprises or particularly useful information in the VTS archives that you've uncovered or you'd like to share tonight?
Oh, there's many surprises. Let's see. One of the recent finds, major finds, is of a gentleman named Carter Dowling, who was enslaved at the seminary. And we have his runaway ad. He and two other gentlemen escaped. And we find them later in Buffalo and in Canada, but they stop on their way in Philadelphia and sit and record their entire account of their escape with William Still, the abolitionist. And we have that whole written record. It's in William Still's Underground Railroad book that has thousands of other recordings like that. But to find someone to be able to name him and to trace his story, and then find him on the other side of freedom where he can say his story and record it, and mention familiar places in this area that we know, so we can confirm him to this place, I think probably was the most exciting piece. And he goes on to Canada to be a labor activist and a railroad worker, and has a family and a really full life. And we know that because he first stopped to kind of share his story, and that's when he starts to develop his own record in freedom.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, it's really great to find these stories and then to be able to share them. Your next question is a multi-pronged question. So one is a compliment. Thank you for your work. And what happens when no descendants are found? Is there a donation or scholarship set up? And do the descendants have to supply an answer to the offer by a certain time frame, or would they be open to this for future generations if one generation has said no?
If no, so we have not come across a case where there are no descendants. I will say there's one family where of the 5 descendants, only 4 are living, and the one that passed away has no descendant, didn't have any descendants herself. So her share went to her siblings. And that was one individual case where we sat with the family, asked them what they wanted to do, if they had any plans. And that was their request, and we were able to say yes. There might be another family where the descendant line stops, and they might decide to donate that share instead of take it. So it's case by case when it doesn't fit within our kind of plan that we have set up. I forget the second part of that question.
Let me get back up to that. Do the descendants have to supply an answer to the offer by a certain time frame, or would they be open to this for future generations if one generation said no?
No, they do not. And yes, the offer stays on the table.
Okay. So there's no.
No, you don't have to answer. If you have bad blood with VTS from years beyond, or family lore or whatever, that is not, I respect that. And if you don't want to deal with this right now and you would like your children to deal with it later, we understand that, and we will not force this on anyone, and the door will always be open.
Thank you. That's important to know. Thank you very much. Another question, you included a picture of the African American community called Mudtown, or as the residents of that community seminary, were folks who worked at both Fiscal High School and VTS live. Did VTS own those properties? Did they own Episcopal High School?
They did not own those properties, and technically they didn't own Episcopal High School either. The connection was that they shared a board of trustees.
And
it was from one of the descendants that Char did a oral history interview with.
An oral history. Thank you. Are there records that indicate the mindset of the slave owners at the time about the institution of slavery? Anything that you've uncovered?
Yes, and everybody was kind of on board with it. They varied it over time with how they felt about it, and they varied a bit. We just redid our website, so I kind of hesitate to send you there because I can't quite pinpoint, but our archives, the seminary archivist, Chris Pope, who's also part of the research team, has a really good handle on the understanding of the writings of those early founding faculty members and where they stood with slavery, as the church was a major player in the institution of slavery, specifically in Virginia.
Okay, and the person who was asking that question is a member from St. Mary's Episcopal Church, who's interested in that question. Another question, can you speak a little more about the decision to include descendants of employees from the Jim Crow era?
It's my understanding that the administration felt that they also did not receive the best treatment. And we know that there are accounts that their time working here for some might have been pleasant, but for others, not so much. And because of the weight of segregation in the Jim Crow era itself, that contributed. We have a descendant family who tells us about their ancestor who worked here, who wanted to study at the seminary, but he couldn't. And so there were other instances like that they felt were worthy enough to include this as part of the reparative work.
Another question, we have a great many questions. Everyone is very interested in this topic, which is wonderful. Again, thank you for your research. Has your research produced any connections between the institution of slavery and the founding of Episcopal High School next door to VTS?
No. If it has, that hasn't been brought to my attention, but I'm pretty sure we haven't come across anything like that yet.
And we have a question, and this actually relates to something that I witnessed, and wanted to ask you about Fiscal High School's participation in this project. Are they willing to revise their institutional history? Would they include, for example, the 1920 strike in which the school fired all of the African American servers and replaced them with white male students? And I'm very interested in the answer to this question, having seen some of the smaller exhibits and displays at the school that didn't really feature any African, very, very minimal. It was almost like they weren't there or part of that landscape when they were. So very interested in how you're seeing that work at the high school.
Right now with the high school, they're not working on this with us. We are familiar with a lot of the teachers and a group there that's doing their own historical research, and we have shared research with one another, but this at the moment is just an initiative that VTS has taken on.
And we have a question asking about, will this video be available? And it will. It will be on our Alexandria Community Remembrance page. The Alexandria Historical Society will also be able to have a copy of it. And we will also have it on our YouTube channel. So there'll be multiple platforms where you can access the video from tonight. And then another question, which I think relates to me a little bit, an exhibit at the Black History Museum would draw community interest. Any possibilities? And I would say, Ebony, I'd be happy to collaborate with you at any time on this project. And you have a standing invitation for exhibition space. So I want to make that offer public tonight. Another question from Dr. Kristen Moon, who's done certainly a lot of research with African American history in Alexandria and has been a great friend, not only and past president of the Alexandrian Historical Society, and friend to the Black History Museum and partner with the ACRP. Meade has a register of births from the 1950s to 60s. That will be, if she wanted to know, that will be of use, and that may be very helpful.
Excellent. Thank you.
Let's see what other this question is an open one. What other Christian dominations enslaved people?
I don't think I'm qualified to correctly answer that, but I would imagine the Episcopalians and the Anglican Church as a whole were not alone in their efforts.
And we know that there was recently the announcement with the Jesuits,
right,
with their reparations fund, and I can't remember the amount. I think it's 100 million that they are.
They're hoping to raise that much.
Yeah, they're going to be raising that money for the descendants of the enslaved. So, and of course, the work at Georgetown with what they're doing with providing reparations for the is it for the education of descendants that were sold in, I think they're 1838.
Yeah, 272 people, and they have their names first and last, and so they were able to work from that list of people to find the many descendants that are living today and offer that opportunity to them.
And another question that we have, are you familiar with Peggy Dean, and did she have descendants who are still living?
I am not familiar with her, but I will add that to our list.
Yeah. And from Dr. Moon, something of use from the Freedmen's Papers, W. Ames McNulty, Bureau, Culpeper and Rappahannock, Virginia, February 13th, 1867 to S.P. Lee in Alexandria. Abe Taylor states that around Christmas, his son Phil Terrell came to his place about 7 miles from Mr. William Burnett's, and against his wishes took his wife Mary away to their home or near Fairfax Seminary, Fairfax County. Joseph Tyrrell, also his son lives at that place. The old man is well known in these parts and is perfectly able to care for himself and his wife. He states that the boys think to get him to come where they are so that they can get what he has saved. He wants his wife returned to him at the expense of his sons Phil and Joe, as his wife was induced to go away by them contrary to his wishes. This is a section in the Fort Ward Report on the Seminary neighborhood and ownership, and Dr. Moon is the author of that amazing history of Fort Ward and what they are. And Fort Ward is looking, reevaluating its interpretation of the site and making it inclusive of the African Americans who lived on Fort Ward and telling their stories parallel to the story of the site as a Civil War fort. And so you're seeing that in all of our historic Alexandria museums and historic sites, where we are really trying to make sure that we are integrating the African American history into our historical narrative. Let me go to our next question. Did the theological teachings of VTS support slavery during these times?
I'm not sure about that, honestly. I know, well, I honestly, I can't speak to that. Like what we know for certain is that 3 of the 4 founding faculty members were slave owners. Many members on the board of trustees for many years were also slave owners, and there were bishops in the surrounding areas and other clergy persons who were also slave owners. And there was a very strong network between all of these gentlemen of hiring out their enslaved labor force, to the benefit of them personally and professionally, and institutionally as a church. So how that overlapped into their theological training, I can't speak to, but it was a very present everyday parts of their life.
Okay. And a comment that could be interesting to share about the seminary's connections to the American Colonization Society. And let me see. The next question is from one of our really good friends of the Office of Historic Alexandria, the City of Alexandria, Amy Birch. I have a statement from a formerly enslaved woman who stated that she and her husband were married at the seminary in 1851 by Dr. Packard. Does VTS have any records that indicate faculty performed religious marriage ceremonies for enslaved people?
I just heard this same story yesterday. So our researchers are uncovering things every day. And this evidence just was brought to my attention. So I imagine there's more like it. And
another question that we have, folklore has a Fiscal having a hanging tree on the property. Have you heard about this, or has there been any research around this piece of folklore?
I have not heard anything about that.
Another question, can you speak to the American Colonization Society? Do we know of any enslaved men and women who worked at VTS who were sent to Liberia?
We do not know that. We do know that there were 4 students in the household, 4 Liberian students in the household of Professor May. His first name is escaping me right now. And he was one of the only one of the 4 founding faculty members who was against slavery, and he actually housed these 4 Liberian students in his home. Whether or not they were directly tied to the American Colonization Society, I do not know. We could probably assume, considering that society in Liberia and Virginia and the Episcopal Church. Christopher Pope would probably be able to directly answer that question. If you wanted more, was that Kristen that asked that, I believe?
Yes, that was Kristen. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she knows Chris.
Yes.
He could give. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Michael Reynolds was sharing that Peggy Dean is a woman who worked for Lancelot Blackford and was formerly enslaved by his family.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
And just wonderful comments for such a great talk. You had, I think we've gotten through all the questions, which were fantastic questions, and we will save this chat for you, Ebony, so you have that. And Ebony, I mean, this has been such an important talk for us to have, and a discussion for us to have. One, if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to reach out to you if they have information or want to find out more?
The reparations program has an email, and it's reparations@vts.edu. And you can find me there and send all your questions, and myself or Dr. Thompson or someone from the research team will be able to get you the answers.
Oh, great. And Dr. Moon was just sharing, let me go back up because we have a couple more questions coming in, that Peggy Dean is also buried at Ivy Hill with the Blackford family plot, and she might be the first African-American to be buried there. And Blackford and from another one of our Alexandria Historical Society board members, Katherine Weinreich, Blackford is buried at the foot of Peggy Dean, and she is the oldest African-American buried at Ivy Hill on King Street, where lots of Episcopal High School and VTS are buried. And Katherine has worked with Ivy Hill Cemetery for a few years, and so she definitely would be a great resource for you to reach out to.
I also want to say, I want to take a moment and really shout out our research team. They do this work, and it is nothing to sleep on. I've said it a million times, it's not easy work, and it can get personal. And it, specifically as a Black woman working in reparations, you kind of run the risk of the research coming to knock on your door at any moment. And so to Char, Maddie and Elizabeth and Chris. I'm really grateful for all the work that they do. They've been churning away at this for, let's see, September 2019 is when we started. So it's their labor that I'm able to share with you today, and it's all their findings. And I just wanted to publicly shout them out and thank them for all of their hard work.
Sure, and we're getting many, many kudos on your talk. And I also want to thank Mike Reynolds from the Alexandria Historical Society, who brought up your name as a great speaker for us. And it's truly been a wonderful evening, and we've learned so much. And like I said, you have an open invitation for an exhibition and a partnership with the Office of Historic Alexandria anytime. And one of the things I think too, as being someone who is in the field of Black history and in the field of Black history now, I'm older than you are, and I know, looking back and looking at this time now, there's no more exciting time for me that I'm witnessing for the uncovering of African-American history, the valuing of African-American history, the interest in all of these stories and how they relate holistically to our country and what we're going through. And so I think that, with your study, your continuing studies at Howard and your work at VTS, there's no more important work. And you are a great leader in the field for us, and someone who is really a wonderful resource here in Alexandria for the work that we're trying to put forward to be a more inclusive and welcoming community. That's what we're doing with the city. That's what our city manager envisions. It's what we're seeing with our equity programs through all Alexandria. It is really making sure that everyone has a place at the table and everything has what they need to be successful when they are at the table. So I just want to thank you again, and we'd love to have another update in the future.
Thank you, Bree. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining.
And many thanks to our audience. You were great, and wonderful questions. Thank you. We had over 30 or more questions in the chat. So definitely people want, I think we could go on for a longer time. People are definitely interested. So we will have you back and we will get updates. So many thanks. Everyone be safe. Have a great evening. We look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Ebony.